Good afternoon, everyone. I can see you. I can see you on sort of a small screen, and I'm afraid to kind of play with it for fear that I will lose all visual. First of all, thank you, Ee-Seul, for inviting me to participate in this seminar series. I've been following the email threads and unfortunately have not been able to participate, but in others. But it looks like you've had a really wonderful roundup of people. It's exciting. There's that kind of interest in this work. I think that what I'm going to, in a minute, I'm going to share my slides and my screen, I think that the approach that I will take is talk to you through my slides. I'm going to be talking about some of my more recent empirical work, and I'll try, and I know we have till 1:30. I'll try and limit my comments to, I think, about 20 or 25 minutes or so, less, and then really open it up for conversation with all of you, with you in the room, and also those of you online about your work, my work, and so forth. Okay? I'm good? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to try this. You might see the back of my regular screen for a minute. Soon you shall. Okay. So are you with me there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So again, I'm at the University of Southern California, and going to be talking about a larger body of work that I've been pursuing for about 10 years now. Basically looking at what is a gravity shift in obviously both the US and international contexts around an area of market-oriented reforms that you can think of as education contracting. I look primarily in public school systems in the United States. I referred to this, and I will talk more about this later, as in earlier work, as the new education privatization in hidden markets. And essentially the gravity shift that I'm talking about is towards more education contracting. So just an increase in the amount of dollars spent by government's money going to for-profit or not-for-profit firms that contract for products or services, more contracting for schooling services in the sense of, at least in the US, we've always had textbook publishers and other kinds of, obviously, vendors. It's been a part of our history for a long time, but much more contracting where we're actually seeing contracts for teachers, for teaching, for very high stakes kinds of assessment services and feedback. In the US, niche targeting in these contracts towards high poverty communities, kids of color, largely because a lot of this contracting is driven by public policy, and so there's public funds attached. We saw that with the No Child Left Behind Act in the United States, and it's continued. And as I argue, and others have argued, with limited accountability, we see a lot of accountability pressures on the public sector increasingly, but that hasn't translated very much into very much understanding of what that looks like when we have the private sector involved in education. Again, I mean, this is not surprising, but you see this was in my inbox about a year ago. There are powerful interest groups that are kind of seeking new angles of influence to build demand for products and services. The Education Industry Association in the United States is one of those interest groups, really looking to find ways to kind of legitimate for vendors products and services that are the ways that are aligned with policy. But there are also, I think it's also important to know, less kind of formalized sorts of interest and political alliances that I've been looking at recently with the software industry, technology companies, really pushing really hard, building connections with government in order to build demand for their services. On that point, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A, I was doing an interview yesterday because the Obama administration here in the United States came out with a new initiative that mandates computer science and coding classes, and we saw a lot of Twitter and sort of lots of talk about that in the technology space, because of course that meant some demand for their products, but lots of interest groups pushing the kind of work that we're seeing. Okay, so the theory of action here, and I have to apologize, one of my classes, I poached this from a class that I'm teaching, but seemed to work well here, is that the theory here behind these kinds of reforms, and I sort of talk about, just came up with this term, coercive outsourcing. I'm not sure it works yet, but the theory is essentially that we have these kinds of reforms based on the principles of the marketplace, and that via these reforms we will have competition. There's limited regulation here and system changing, and through that we will arrive at innovation, better services, more responsive services, more accountability in terms of our government dollars and community engagement, which will all translate into improved student outcomes and the public and private good. So that's the theory of action, right, of a lot of these reforms, including the government contracting that I'm talking about. I've been very interested in this theory of action, initially mapping what's happening, particularly around the education contracting work, but also through empirical work, trying to understand, how this actually plays out. Where are both the truths and the flaws in this theory of action, particularly when public funds are involved. So I've talked about this work as this sort of trend as the new education privatization, and essentially in that defined is when for-profits or not-for-profits receive funding from public school systems or whatever else it's called, the other comparable term in other systems, in exchange for services and products, and have significant autonomy and limited regulation in their operations. In the US, that means that they're exempt from many federal, state, and local accountability regulations, providing services, again, close to the instructional core, really defining what gets taught and how it gets taught. One of these examples of that is contracting, for example, for virtual teachers, virtual curriculum. You actually have a teacher or a school supplanting a regular school, and there's a contract there. New sectors emerging. This is important in terms of who's pushing this. So e-commerce, obviously Facebook, Google, these media giants really big in this space, education space now, and then being legitimated in important ways by policy, whether it's through announcements by Obama or through other kinds of policy mandates. I want to zoom in actually on one aspect of this work on education contracting, theory of action, implications for equity and access, by looking at some work I've recently completed, which allowed us essentially to look at a national experiment in the US in education contracting for education services for the poor. This was referred to as the Supplemental Educational Services Initiative. Any of you familiar with this acronym or this term? It was under the No Child Left Behind Act. Just for interaction's sake, a show of hands, has anyone heard of either No Child Left Behind, obviously, or this federally funded tutoring initiative in the US? Anybody out there?
Yeah.
Okay, good to know. So we were lucky enough to get some money to do a longitudinal mixed method study of this. And we're talking about some of the findings from this work. We have a website with a lot of our products on there, but want to acknowledge the districts that we've been working with on this. The partnership has been critical. LA, of course, is the second largest school district in the United States. So we're talking about a lot of numbers of kids here. Thank you to these districts, and also to our funder. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators, in particular, Carolyn Heinrich at the University of Texas, Austin, who's the co-PI on this work, as well as Anna Lee Good, who directed the research at this work and is in Wisconsin Center for Education Research. I think that it's useful to essentially just review briefly the design of this particular policy. Essentially, again, part of NCLB and its market-oriented part of its reforms, requiring schools not making test score targets for 3 years to offer families, low-income families, the opportunities for remedial instruction. So this was supplemental instruction. Mm-hmm. So this was a set aside. The districts had to, no new funds, this is important. The districts had to set aside 20% of their Title I funding. And this translated, one can envision, under No Child Left Behind, as more and more schools and districts weren't making test score targets, billions of dollars. So lots of money ultimately becoming available through this initiative. Districts, via parent choice, could contract with both for-profit or not-for-profit vendors, but it really ended up being mainly the for-profit sector that had market share here. That's the design of the policy against a kind of mandated education contracting, if you will. It's part, again, of this a larger, the bigger picture here. And I speak a lot about this, more about this, and some of the trends in this work in a book that's titled Scrutiny, that's published by Harvard Ed Press. But basically, we became very interested in our study of education companies contracting under No Child Left Behind, in a particular kind of company, which is the technology company. And the reason we were interested in that was that there was evidence empirically when we looked at the number of students signing up that they were gaining market share, that they were the big players serving, say, in one instance, a technology company in the United States serving over 12,000 students in Los Angeles, just one of a host of companies. And so we were very interested in looking at these technology companies for these and other reasons. Mm-hmm. You're with me?
Yep.
Okay. Do you want? You're so small, so it's easy in the so it's easy for me to sort of go into my own little kind of intellectual bubble here. So you have to kind of stop me.
All right.
When I do that. I just wanted to sort of say again, I'm really trying to do some empirical work here on this as I do translational research, but basically, again, we were trying to understand if these companies were gaining market share, these technology companies, what actually were they doing? What were they offering kids of color and low-income kids in terms of the quality of an instruction? What did that look like? And so what we use, our model here is as what we call a fully integrated mixed method approach. So essentially that meant in our design, again, this was a very large qualitative data set against these districts. But one of the things that we really liked about this research when we went in to see what these companies were actually doing instructionally with these kids is, of course, we did the focus groups and the interviews, but we also developed an observation instrument specifically for looking at digital settings that allowed us to really look at issues of of access and teacher, teacher capacity and all sorts of things in that work. So that was the qualitative design, and then tightly integrated with our quantitative work, which Carol and Dr. Heinrich was heading up, looking at standardized test score data, looking at students eligible for supplemental education services. It was a quasi-experimental design, part of a larger study. Again, this digital component, and this was exploratory analysis with a very rigorous design in terms of propensity score matching and so forth. Can talk more about that later. One of the things that's sort of important about this work, I think, when we talk about marketization and we talk back and with folks who are very much sort of talking about, the importance of, say, the more involvement of, say, the Gates Foundation, or more portfolio models, or more corporate charter schools, is to really kind of as we talk about that, to back that up against existing research. So one of the things that's interested me when I write about technology companies is the absolute, really, lack of research in ways that the rhetoric very much outpaces the research. In terms of what we know in terms of student outcomes. I'll talk about that here. So there are very few studies on that. We know a little bit about the kinds of outcomes that matter in the technology tutoring space, the technology company space. We know the importance of live interaction. We know the importance of equal access, real-time data, and so forth. But generally, we don't know much, which is why in this work, again, whenever in marketization, there's often something new that business is pushing. And technically, in lots of ways, it's best to go back to some of our good old, a solid research base from public schooling and from our work in schools over the years. And so here we went back to what we do know about what makes sense for low-income kids, high-poverty kids around supplemental services. These are important. This is important background when I talk about what companies are and are not doing. But you can look through this list to give me a chance to have a glass of water. Sip of water. The question is, so this is good out-of-school time services. Does this hold in a digital setting? One of the things that I want to highlight here, the takeaway from this screen, this sort of notion of characteristics, is really that one of the things that we found when we first got into this space of technology companies is that there was a lot of information, right? Think back to that theory of action around market reform. Lots of information being shared with parents and teachers that, okay, we are an online program, but in fact, there was extreme variation in what that looked like. It could vary from an online program, technology program that a parent chose, could be everything from this sort of interactive kind of conversation we're having here to a student being asked to pick up the phone, a landline, and call in. Not exactly high tech. So companies saying that they're interactive and sort of tutor-driven and one-on-one, when in fact, in some instances, most of the curriculum is driven by a prepackaged curriculum. It's there, it's loaded, you take it home, not a lot of live interaction. So part of what we tried to do is begin to classify what exactly are these technology companies and other companies selling. Now, this is where we get, I think, to some interesting stuff. Again, this is exploratory work. We're pushing it out in a paper that will be hopefully available in a journal here in the U.S. soon. But what we saw is what we were interested in, kind of what these providers were charging per hour. And the reason that this was interesting was because this was an initiative in which there was a per pupil allocation, so you could get $2,000 per pupil. So the more that providers had limited regulation, and so could charge, pretty much what they wanted within a range. So the more that providers charged per hour, the fewer number of hours students received. Now, why is that important? I mean, it's important in very pure terms from a cost perspective, but based on our other empirical research, it was only when we began to see students receiving in and around the range of 30 to 50 hours of instruction that we began to see anything in the way of effects on achievement. Anything. I mean, largely we saw minimal effects. And how we explain that essentially is we began to understand that a lot of students weren't really receiving any intervention at all, few hours. So here in this instance, you see digital providers charging more per hour, about $31 more per hour than non-technology providers, which translated into about 13 hours of tutoring over the course of the year, which is nothing, right? Very little. So here the cost really not justifying in any way the quality of instruction. Again, we went in and we wanted to sort of look more deeply into what was actually happening in the classroom through our observation instrument. And here's some sort of, some evidence from our big N of observations that digital compared to non-digital was really not providing that kind of high leverage, higher order sort of approach that was being claimed in marketing materials. Now, I want to say at this point, because I might not have a chance to emphasize this as much, is that I'm really not making in this presentation or in the work in Equal Scrutiny, an argument against digital education or the involvement of technology companies in schools. We have lots of examples and even evidence of where there are ways in which that these companies can actually address some of the long-standing problems of public schooling around access, around timing, around space. I'm not making that argument. The argument I'm making is that we need much more transparency around what these companies are doing, what they're charging in order to discern quality and access. So preliminary findings here, I think that the takeaway is that we do, in fact, not at that point really great news for the technology companies, and that in-person higher gains in math, that where we see a kind of more of a blended approach, again, we tend to see it's a better approach to try and translate these findings as sort of as swiftly as I can to get to the discussion. But I think what's most important about some of our findings in this work, again, think back to the theory of action, is that we did see evidence of high quality kinds of products and services being driven by the market, being driven by providers offered to schools, but what we call English language learners and students with disabilities were much likely to receive this kind of tutoring. In other words, it was available to them. There was a supply there, but providers were choosing in a environment of limited regulation, were not choosing to make this available to those populations for whatever reason, meaning that they were getting less. Inequities are exacerbated here. Again, providers charging more. Students receiving fewer hours of instruction, not correlated with the kinds of gains. And again, my point earlier about some really problems of access and disparities between in and across students in terms of the quality of the service that they received. So here briefly, just a couple more points. Oh no. We're okay. Yeah, we started at 12:30.
Yeah.
Just a few more points, which is, I didn't go into this in my comments, but this is the larger picture in terms of where we see technology companies in this market space in education contracting. There is very much still a digital divide. Don't let anybody convince you otherwise. I mean, there's a digital divide in terms of high income and low income schools, in terms of the capacity of teachers and schools to provide this kind of instruction that's being sold by these companies. There's a divide in terms of that's very important in terms of internet access. Again, market-based reforms, the assumption, sometimes very little attention to what are critical details in terms of equity and access. Is there internet access? I was curious. It was interesting when a head of a prominent e-commerce company in the U.S. said, "Well, you know, there's really, I'm not sure what we're talking about in terms of the digital divide, in terms of this, you know, the problems with cyber schooling and so forth, and our companies work in there. If students don't have access to internet for students, then they can just go to their nearest internet cafe or Starbucks. What's the problem? We can do that." So we did a kind of experiment where we were just interested. We mapped in our own community where we do our work in Los Angeles, here in the poorer areas of Los Angeles, if a student in the group among the populations that we were studying that had selected a technology company as their instructor, if they needed to do some work after school or during non-school hours or as school to get internet access and they didn't have it, where would they go? Well, this is a very large community geographically. Well, they in fact, there's 2 of them, and they'd in fact have to cross a major highway to get to one of them. So not very accessible, or actually, in case of 6, actually go to an internet cafe on a highway. Not really accessible as a Starbucks way. Contrast this with, I don't know if you're familiar with Santa Monica, one of the more wealthier parts of Los Angeles, socioeconomically, over 200 places that offered, you know, internet connections. Again, we can't make these assumptions as we move this stuff forward that there are equal kinds of conditions or supporting conditions for kids. It is a travesty to do that. And so some of these emerging, there are lots of emerging policy issues, but the 3 that I would highlight here and opening it up to discussion, again, is that I really do think, particularly relative to the work I did earlier, where companies were really focusing so much on standardized tests, that there is something about you know, this kind of marketization, the role of these technology companies, that has promise in terms of transformative education, but companies are not delivering on that promise yet, and they are charging a lot. We know that empirically. It's imperative in this work to ask who, especially when we have quite seductive sorts of tools and services, who is benefiting, who or who isn't deciding who should get what kind of curriculum, what the class size should be. It's advertised as a one-on-one class, and in fact, in an online environment, you've got 1 teacher and 100 students. Who's making that decision? Who sees that? In what communities is that occurring? And how, of course, does that sync or not with the so-called democratic purposes of schooling, the kind of public good that we talk about? And also this issue of standards and accountability. I tend to raise this question a lot in my discussion with the private sector because these terms seem to have some resonate for them. So I want to ask, what are the minimal levels of performance for companies building revenue and profits from education public policy? What is the minimum that we should regulate, and what can we ask from them in return for the revenues that are funding them? So why don't I end with that
Right.
and open it up for questions.